Welcome back to Disturbed Reality. In recent days, the topic of civil war when it pertains to the West has become a mainstream discussion following the political assassination of Charlie Kirk. Fears of reprisal attacks or further attacks from those on the ideological side that the shooter seemingly espoused were also concerns. As I write this script, thankfully widespread further violence has not occurred, but the reactions to the situation on social media truly highlighted how desensitized to violence we've become as a society. A civil war is uniquely terrifying because it turns neighbours into enemies and shatters trust in the familiar. The violence isn't distant, it consumes homes, streets and families. It dissolves the illusion of safety, proving the greatest danger often comes not from outsiders, but from those closest to us. The sick thing is, the participants on social media seemingly fanning the flames for a civil war, especially those celebrating death, while knowing exactly what they're doing and the potential dangers of it, are the types of individuals who more often than not have no real concept, experience or relationship with violence. It won't be a middle-class pink-haired pudgy liberal, nor a conservative influencer on the front lines. It will be us, primarily the working class regardless of political ideology, who will be in the thick of it, being the most affected, as is the case all the time with societal collapse or conflict in general. I tend not to get too political on this channel, and quite frankly, in the long term, I don't even believe this to be a left-right issue per se, as that political model, in my opinion, is on the way out for a much darker and totalitarian technocratic system, controlled by megacorporations, AI and the likes. I think we're seeing an attempt to accelerate the collapse of the traditional political system to make way for something different. 2020 was the starting point of this acceleration, the biggest transfer of wealth, possibly in human history, corporate consolidation, and the increase of corporate feudalism via the means of printing trillions of dollars, followed by us plebs being divided, before we will eventually be ruled over with an iron fist. UBI, a global surveillance system and God knows what else, though maybe I'm just a crazy conspiracy theorist. But regardless, the nature of what I have witnessed on social media in the past days got me once again thinking about the topic of civil war, and as I was in this mindset, the internet provided a real-life example of just how brutal that scenario actually is. When the Tatmadaw, Myanmar's military, seized power on the 1st of February 2021, many in the international community expected a short, ugly episode that would quickly fade into sanctions and diplomacy. Instead, the coup blew up long-running fractures into a full-scale, multi-front civil conflict, with the military on one side and an array of resistance forces, such as the newly formed People's Defence Forces, PDF, long-standing ethnic armed organisations, EAOs, such as the Kachin, Karen and Arakan armies, and a bewildering array of local self-defence militias on the other. The result is a war that is geographically scattered, strategically complex and viscerally brutal. Yet, outside specialist outlets and diaspora networks, it seldom breaks the sustained front-page attention that it deserves. Several structural and perceptual causes explain this media eclipse, and understanding them is essential, because under-coverage amplifies the suffering it fails to make visible. Firstly, Myanmar's conflict is highly fragmented and technically hard to cover. Unlike wars that concentrate in a single accessible theatre, violence in Myanmar is dispersed across borderlands, Kachin, Northern Shan, and Rakhine to name a few, and also peri-urban areas where front lines shift often and communication is deliberately disrupted. The military junta uses internet shutdowns, mobile blackouts, and has heavy restrictions on journalists. Many independent reporters have been jailed, threatened, and even forced into exile. That creates enormous logistical barriers for foreign newsrooms. Whistleblowers, local journalists, and fixers risk imprisonment or even worse. Ultimately, verification is slow, and big media organisations forced to choose between staff safety and scoops often reprioritise stories that they can cover reliably. The pattern of restricted access and journalistic peril has been documented repeatedly by press freedom and human rights organisations. Secondly, geopolitics and news incentives skew attention elsewhere. Editorial calendars in Western newsrooms follow perceived threat to domestic audiences and advertisers. energy shocks, refugee flows, terrorism risks, and great power competition. Russia's war in Ukraine, for example, has immediate strategic and economic repercussions in Europe and North America. It mobilized international coverage, funding for war reporting, and public interest in a way Myanmar cannot match. Myanmar's tragedy, by contrast, feels distant, regionally contained, and lacking clear geopolitical hook for many Western consumers, even though it produces mass displacement, human rights violations, and regional instability. Analysts have pointed to this structural bias as a major reason as to why Myanmar remains undercovered. Thirdly, competing narratives and information chaos make sustained storytelling difficult. Myanmar's conflict mixes long-running ethnic struggles, a failed transition from military rule, a civilian shadow government, and newly emerged resistance groups. Each actor promotes competing narratives, and the internet is rich in propaganda, doctored images, and unverified claims. Newsrooms and journalists, wary of amplifying misinformation, will sometimes hold back on stories until verification is possible. In practice, verification in Myanmar is often impossible in real time. This slows coverage and reduces opportunity for the kind of continuous human-scale reporting that draws Western audiences in. All of these structural constraints compound a fourth factor: emotional fatigue and moral hierarchies in global news competition. News organisations and audiences have limited bandwidth. When multiple crises compete for attention, those with immediate apparent geopolitical stakes, dramatic visuals, or big-name personalities tend to win. The chronic suffering of Myanmar, which unfolds in far-flung villages, inside burned towns, and across mountain ridgelines, lacks theatrical, continuous imagery that sustained prolonged media coverage. That does not make the story less urgent, it makes it easier to ignore. Commentators and scholars have called this a problem of newsworthiness economics. The cost of that neglect is concrete. The world overlooks specific, documented atrocities. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and UN bodies have recorded patterns that together amount to possible war crimes and crimes against humanity. The military junta's tactics documented in investigations include indiscriminate airstrikes on villages and displacement camps, targeted massacres and summary executions, systematic arbitrary detention and torture, widespread SA, and scorched earth operations that burn civilian housing and rice fields. Amnesty have published investigations describing airstrikes that killed children at schools, as well as attacks on refugee camps that left dozens dead. Incidents, when investigated, read like textbook war crimes. The United Nations Human Rights Office has also reported mounting civilian casualties and forced displacements in 2023 and 2024. These are not rumours, these are verified patterns with grave legal and humanitarian implications. But brutality in Myanmar is not the monopoly of the military junta. Some resistance groups and armed ethnic organisations have also committed abuses. State-level and independent reporting has documented instances of extrajudicial killings, forced recruitment, including child soldiers in some areas, summary punishments of suspected informants, and abuses against minority civilians by local militias. Violence between ethnic groups, or between ethnic militias and newly formed People Defence Forces (PDF) units, has sometimes escalated into reprisal killings and forced displacements. The result is a morally complicated landscape. Victims are not always clearly divided along a simple state versus rebels line, and some communities suffer from intercommunal violence that predates the 2021 coup. A sober assessment must acknowledge both the asymmetric state capacity for destruction and the localized patterns of rebel and militia abuses. A central driver of the conflict's endurance and of its particular savagery is ethnic fragmentation. Myanmar is not a unitary society, but a patchwork of dozens of ethnic nationalities with varying grievances and territorial claims. The military's long history of centralized rule and of brutal counter-insurgency against ethnic armed organizations have left deep scars and cycles of mistrust. In Rakhine, for example, the Rohingya have endured decades of systematic discrimination, culminating in the 2017 campaign that the UN said bore hallmarks of ethnic cleansing. Recent fighting in Rakhine and surrounding areas has again placed Rohingya civilians in mortal peril. Elsewhere, the Kachin, Shan and Karen peoples, along with other minorities, have their own armed groups and local dynamics, which makes for a conflict that is simultaneously local, ethnic and national, therefore harder for a single narrative to capture. Why does this matter beyond the loss of headlines? For one thing, media attention drives political attention. Large sustained coverage creates pressure for sanctions, humanitarian corridors, and regional diplomatic responses, whereas under-coverage lowers the political cost of inaction. For another, the absence of widespread scrutiny reduces the deterrent against further atrocities. Where atrocities are visible, governments and international bodies often find it harder to shrug, but where atrocities remain invisible, impunity grows. Finally, under-coverage robs displaced people and victims of witnesses beyond their immediate networks, making it harder for documentation efforts and transnational justice mechanisms to assemble the evidentiary record for further accountability. But what practical steps could break this cycle of neglect? The first is for outlets to invest in networks of trusted local journalists and exiled reporters who can verify stories even under blackout conditions, a model that some independent Myanmar outlets and diaspora organisations already use. Secondly, broader coverage needs not mean breathless daily dispatches. It can mean sustained explanatory reporting that unpacks local dynamics, tracks verified human rights investigations, and follows displacement and refugee flows into neighbouring countries. Thirdly, audiences and funders should recognise that editorial attention, driven purely by immediacy or geopolitical impact, leaves moral blind spots. Support for long-form journalism and regional bureaus pays dividends in democratic oversight. Ultimately, Myanmar's civil war is not out of the news because the atrocities stopped, but it's out of the news because the conflict is logistically hard to cover, politically less resonant to Western editorial priorities, fragmented into multiple, overlapping struggles, and blurred by disinformation and danger to journalists. Those structural dynamics matter. They mean the most dramatic victims of modern Southeast Asia, burned villages, bombed schools, and families trudging across borders, are also the least likely to be seen by the global public. Bringing them into view requires more than just moral outrage. It requires a practical reallocation of reporting resources, safer channels for local verification, and an audience willing to sustain attention to suffering that does not immediately alter commodity prices or security calculations. The moral test of journalism is not just to cover the obvious wars, it is also to cover the quiet, complex ones, where the ground truth of cruelty accumulates in the dark. Now, speaking of cruelty, let's talk about a very recent video to come out of the country of Myanmar. A video that perfectly highlights the true level and nature of the barbarity faced by countless people in the country. But nevertheless, what happens in the actual video? The video in question is 3 minutes and 11 seconds in length, and it has been shot during daylight hours in what appears to be a small village that is next to a large body of water, possibly a lake or a large river. It was apparently shot in the Saigang Township region, and it may have been recorded as early as July of 2025. For context, the backstory behind the clip is murky to say the least. However, the murder was seemingly carried out by the military junta, the Tatmadaw. Allegedly, the victim belonged to a People's Defence Force group. The incident apparently occurred in the Mai Zili Shang village, about 7 miles north of Mingun Pagoda, according to the military commander of the Dawn Soldier Battalion of the local defence group, who apparently the victim belonged to. After clashes broke out in the area, between the 24th and 26th of July, the army deployed military in the area. The residents of the Mazali Chang village, which has over 100 households on the west bank of the Yawadwai River, make their living from agriculture and fishing. Most of the villagers had fled in advance due to the fighting, but Kozo Zen, a 30-year-old from the village, was caught by the military stationed in the area while bathing in the river on the morning of the incident. After being tortured and questioned about his links to the PDF, he was killed around 3 PM in a compound south of a village near a monastery and a school, according to the defectors. As you play the video, you are met with the sight of a captive who is blindfolded and is sitting down on the dirt floor. Kneeling down next to him is a military person. Right off the bat, you are met with brutality almost instantaneously. The man kneeling next to the victim plunges a knife directly into the centre of the captive's chest, drawing out a deep exhale of pain. As he is stabbed, the captive leans over forwards in absolute agony. At this point, another man enters shot, carrying what looks like an extremely rusty machete variant, and he then begins hacking away at the victim's feet, just above the ankles. In a couple of big swings with the blade, he completely snaps the victim's left leg just above the ankle, and this causes the victim's foot to point in a direction that it really shouldn't be. The victim lets out light exhales of pain as he then lays down onto his back. The machete-wielding junta member then hacks away at the other ankle, eventually breaking it as well. At this point, another person with a machete then enters shot, and he begins to hack away at the back of the victim's neck, who has rolled over onto his side at this point. The blade thuds and bounces off the neck, not causing deep lacerations, but it seemingly knocks out the victim. As the captive is being hacked up, a more senior looking member of the junta screams, "PDF," alleging that the victim was part of a defense group. The killer hacking away at the ankles continues to do his thing, and he eventually severs one of the captive's feet. He then holds it up to the camera before mockingly saying, "PDF." With the foot still in hand, the machete-wielding killer talks to his buddy, and he says, "I feel so satisfied." As they have their discussion, the other machete-wielding killer hands his blade over to another member of the group, and this person then saws the victim's head off, completely decapitating him, leaving his corpse in a pool of its own blood. They then rest the head on the chest of the corpse, literally for a photo. They pose and joke with each other as they do this. Somebody then takes the corpse and he begins to drag it off. At this point, the headless corpse is laid out next to the river, and it's resting on a piece of plastic. One of the military men tries to use a garden hoe to cut open the victim's stomach, but this doesn't work, it just bounces off. At this point in time, somebody else then takes a combat knife and he cuts vertically from the top of the chest all the way down to the bottom of the abdominal area. As he does this, somebody can be heard making reaching sounds in the background like he's about to be sick. While the body is being cut open, the killer who hacked off a foot then walks into shot and he cuts off the corpse's penis, which makes everybody in the group laugh. He then moves on to hacking off the victim's remaining foot. After a few seconds, the torso of the corpse is completely cut open, exposing the organs. Another jump cut then occurs. At this point, it shows two of the junta members picking up the body. One has the arms, and the other is holding onto what remains of the legs. They count 1, 2, 3, before then throwing the body into the river. The person filming fixates on where the body was thrown into the river, and all you see is a cloud of blood in the water. The video ends there. This one was absolutely brutal, and it goes to show, when it comes to gore videos online, obviously many people will talk about Mexico, or Brazil, Latin America, the Middle East, etc. But Myanmar, ever since 2021, has become a hotbed for gore videos. I've seen some absolutely shocking pieces of content from the area since I've been covering this channel, and this is just yet another example. But, like I was saying at the start of the video, and I know I rambled on, it's an area that gets no coverage whatsoever in the West. Not in the UK at least. Maybe it's different elsewhere, but I never hear about Myanmar in the UK. Which is sad considering the circumstances that are plaguing that country right now. But anyway, that is the video. I hope you enjoyed it, if you can enjoy this sort of content. As always guys, thanks for the support. The links to my, I guess, other social medias will be in the pinned comment. My Twitch, my Twitter, etc. And also, just to let you guys know, I am thinking about making another YouTube channel. When I say thinking about it, I think I will. Basically an old school commentary channel where nothing is scripted and any topic goes, essentially, Whether that be life stories, embarrassing moments, depressing moments, good moments, whether that be discussing topics in society, philosophy, any topic basically goes, is the mantra of this potential channel. Just an old school commentary channel, essentially. It's something that I've been thinking about for a long time. You know, there's a lot about this channel I enjoy, but obviously there's a lot I don't. Number one, the content that I cover. Number two, the nature of like writing scripts and things of that nature. I kind of want a place to where I can just sound off and ultimately be myself. The people on Twitch know who I am. You know, they know I talk a lot of shit. I got a lot to say. Whether I make sense or not is another matter. But I would like a place on YouTube for, again, really just for me more than anything. And if you guys learn something along the way, that's probably doubtful. But if you do, that's great. If I make you laugh, that's even better. And yeah, I just want to do something a bit different. So yeah, old school commentary channel, totally unscripted. Ultimately just me talking a load of old nonsense, but hopefully some deep topics, some funny topics, anything and everything, essentially. That's the goal. There is no goal, basically. There is no plan, just a commentary channel. But anyway, as always, stay safe, and I'll catch you on the next one.